In the years immediately after the Second World War, the United States enjoyed sole ownership of nuclear weaponry. No other nation had this powerful new weapon in their arsenal. Their main rival Russia would not develop their own weapon for several more years, or so U.S. officials believed. After Russia unexpectedly detonated their own atomic weapon in 1949, signaling an end to American monopoly of the bomb, the United States incorporated nuclear weapons into their foreign policy strategies to contain communism and limit Soviet influence around the world and to keep the U.S. public safe as tensions between the two rivals ebbed and flowed over the course of the Cold War era. A key idea behind U.S. nuclear weapons policy was the concept of deterrence. Possession of the bomb would keep America safe, as no nation would dare attack the United States knowing that the U.S. might retaliate with nuclear weapons. The United States initially included nuclear weapons and the idea of deterrence into its global policy of containment. Economic, political, and, eventually, military containment was meant to limit Soviet advances abroad and ensure American safety from future conflicts. America's monopoly on atomic weapons would aid that policy. However, the landscape of deterrence drastically shifted when the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb in 1949, ending the U.S.'s sole possession of this powerful weapon. This development prompted new questions for officials regarding the effectiveness of deterrence and the potential implications if the Soviet Union acquired a larger nuclear arsenal. By the mid-1950s, under the Eisenhower administration's New Look military strategy, the U.S. incorporated a revised nuclear policy to confront the Soviet Union and wage a potential future atomic war, massive retaliation. Under this doctrine, the United States had the option to respond to any attack, even a non-nuclear one, with an overwhelming nuclear response. This response would target both military and civilian populations, ensuring that any enemy nuclear strike would result in complete annihilation, thus acting as a potent deterrent. For massive retaliation to be an effective deterrent, it was vital for the United States to possess a sufficiently large nuclear stockpile. The concern was that if the Soviet Union held more nuclear weapons than the U.S., American deterrence capabilities would be compromised, leaving the nation vulnerable. Conversely, a larger U.S. nuclear arsenal was intended to make the Russians hesitant to attack due to the overwhelming fear of retaliation. The need to have more nuclear weapons available than the Soviet Union fueled a nuclear arms race, compelling both nations to develop thousands of atomic weapons in pursuit of deterrence and to keep the threat of massive retaliation a reality. By the 1960s, the massive stockpiles of nuclear weapons in the U.S. and Soviet Union, combined with the continuing strategy of atomic deterrence, gave rise to an updated nuclear policy during the Kennedy administration, the concept of assured destruction. The core tenet of assured destruction dictated that the United States must possess the capability to deliver a severe retaliatory attack on the Soviet Union following any initial Soviet strike on the U.S. If the Soviets understood that even a surprise attack against the U.S. would have disastrous consequences for Russia, they would be deterred from a potential first strike. The same idea held true for the United States. This strategic framework for assured destruction then established the foundation for the more comprehensive doctrine known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The seemingly absurd logic of MAD was that due to the sheer volume of nuclear weapons held by both the United States and the Soviet Union, their actual deployment was effectively unthinkable. Engaging in nuclear warfare would inevitably lay waste to the entire planet, ensuring that neither side could emerge victorious. A vital precondition for the functioning of mutually assured destruction was that both nations had to accept a degree of vulnerability to the other. This acceptance of mutual defenselessness was paramount, as any perceived efforts by one side to enhance its protection against a nuclear assault could destabilize the precarious balance. Such defensive actions might either incite the adversary to launch a preemptive attack or lead them to conclude that the strengthening nation was preparing its own nuclear strike. Regardless of the specific interpretation, any disruption to this delicate power balance would inevitably influence the uneasy calm established under the principles of mutually assured destruction. Despite the idea of vulnerability as a key to deterring nuclear war, the American public was well aware of the potential danger they faced even in their own homes as the result of U.S. overseas policies during the Cold War. Civil defense was a significant U.S. government initiative during the era aimed at mitigating public fear of nuclear war and keeping Americans committed to the global standoff. Civil defense promoted the belief that Americans could survive a nuclear attack through preparation. If every American did their part to prepare for a potential nuclear conflict, then the U.S. had a better chance of winning the Cold War if it turned hot. Through preparedness, the American family became intimately involved in the Cold War and global policy of containment. A key objective was ensuring more American families survived than their Soviet counterparts, thereby winning a future nuclear war and preserving democracy and the American way of life. Citizens were tasked with staying prepared and vigilant at home as U.S. foreign policy confronted communism around the world. The idea of sheltering was part of the Eisenhower administration's nuclear strategy in the 1950s, but increasing Cold War tensions, especially around the Berlin crisis of 1960 and the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, placed a greater emphasis on the topic during the Kennedy administration. The U.S. government promoted shelter programs, offering incentives for construction, reminding citizens of their responsibility and reassuring Americans of their safety, through educational films and information materials. Despite this, critics contended shelters were ineffective against powerful bombs, radiation, and fallout, and that their existence encouraged war by suggesting survivability. Furthermore, fallout shelters were criticized as discriminatory, largely accessible only to wealthier, middle-class, suburban white individuals. Moral dilemmas plagued the civil defense program as well. For instance, the "gun thy neighbor" scenario asked families if they would be willing to shoot their own neighbors to prevent them from entering their fallout shelter at the start of a nuclear attack. These grim scenarios, and the growing understanding of the consequences of a major nuclear exchange, public opinion generally opposed fallout shelters by the mid-1960s, viewing them as a waste of money and nuclear war as unsurvivable. Only about 200,000 were built by 1960. The Atoms for Peace campaign, launched by the Eisenhower administration in 1953, emerged during a period of intense nuclear arms buildup and widespread global fear concerning nuclear weapons and weapons testing. The campaign's primary goal was to ease public concerns by promoting the peaceful benefits of atomic energy. This initiative sought to demonstrate America's intent to use nuclear energy for constructive purposes, rather than solely for warfare. However, the campaign had a dual purpose beyond simply showcasing America's peaceful use of atomic power. It was also a propaganda strategy to alleviate public concerns, which were rising around the world, over continued atomic testing in the U.S. and Pacific Ocean. The main messages of the campaign were that these atomic tests resulted in scientific breakthroughs for the peaceful use of the atom and that the U.S. had to continue weapons testing in order to counter Soviet weapons testing. To help spread the Atoms for Peace message, the U.S. government provided the public with exhibits on nuclear technology, created articles and booklets to promote the peaceful use of atomic power, and worked with private groups to produce short films about the peaceful atom, including cartoons for children, such as Walt Disney's 1957 short, Our Friend the Atom. For decades, nuclear war as a result of U.S. and Soviet foreign policies was a constant concern for both Americans and Soviet citizens and the global public in general. Though they were an important tool for the U.S. government for both deterrence and containment, in time, the vast amount of nuclear weapons in U.S. and Soviet arsenals, along with increased public pressure, led the two superpowers to take measures to back away from the strategy of mutually assured destruction and work jointly to reduce their stockpiles of nuclear weapons through a series of talks and treaties in the 1970s and 1980s.